America has been portrayed as the land of freedoms, with universal, unalienable rights since its inception. However, the right to suffrage has been one of the most contested and hard-won for many diverse American citizens. Those in power in varying levels of government were and still are afraid of threats to their power, and so refuse many people to vote on a massive racial scale. The fight for equal and fair voting is splattered across our young nation's pages, and the battle still continues on to this day. America has long been a haven for the white, property-owning men that became its founders.
The oldest form of voter suppression was property qualifications. So for a long period, you had to have own a certain amount of estate or real estate to be able to vote. But the key thing is that really that kind of voter suppression, which goes all the way back to England, was usually fairly weak in America. And what's remarkable is that between the revolution, between 1770s, 1780s, and about the 1820s, almost all of those go away.
Later, as racism took a stronger hold on America, the countering of progressive steps towards African American suffrage appeared to prevent black men entering the polls, the most intense occurrences of which happened during the post-Civil War period of Reconstruction. In the post-Civil War climate, the radical Republican-dominated Congress was determined to create laws to give equal rights to all those who were enslaved. Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which essentially shut down all southern state governments and divided the Confederacy into 5 military districts for the duration of time until those districts ratified the 14th Amendment. This act was a follow-up to the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. It guaranteed all rights of citizenship to former enslaved people and those born in the U.S. Though blacks won the right to vote on paper, they were kept from the polls through acts of horrific violence and racist laws. President Andrew Johnson and the segregationist Democratic Party opposed all the ratified amendments and were responsible for installing former Confederate leaders in local and state governments in the South who worked actively to undermine black rights. Terrorist groups such as the KKK used fear tactics and intimidation to keep blacks from voting. Some of the worst incidents of violence against African Americans attempting to vote occurred in Mississippi, with shootings of blacks at Fort Gibson, Vicksburg, and Yazoo City. Much of America was racist at the time to a point where free blacks exercising their rights to vote could not be tolerated, and this racial impact would continue to shape black rights for decades to come. Unequal rights and constant lack of representation in the polls stirred up civil rights activists who were determined to ensure voting rights for all American citizens. The civil rights movement's power was heightened in the 1950s and 60s, and was composed of mostly nonviolent sit-ins and boycotts to draw attention to the need for equal rights laws to protect all citizens and their right to vote.
So the civil rights movement in the late 1940s through the early 1960s, which is an alliance between historically black churches in the South, but also with progressive organizations across the United States, that was highly effective to overthrow the overt voter suppression and to overthrow segregation.
While more and more groups earn that constitutional right, modern voting technology has led to modern, more intricate forms of suppression. Nowadays, voter suppression is buried and hidden underneath the paperwork. One such example is strict voter ID laws, requirements to present government-issued ID and other legal documents to be eligible to vote. Procuring documents can be expensive and time-consuming, especially for those in lower-income communities and people with disabilities. This in turn strikes the biggest blow against communities of color. In 2004, Proposition 200 on the Arizona ballot encouraged stricter requirements and policies on being able to submit a ballot, including showing personal, government-issued ID, and a whole host of personal information that was set to eliminate the many voices who could not collect such documents and information. As many of the hard-working class of America do not have the time to vote in the polls on Election Day, they are forced to mail in their ballots as an alternative.
They're looking at the data and they're saying, oh, these people who voted by absentee ballot and the ballots showed up really late, again, poor working class people that are like too busy to turn their stuff in, their ballots showed up later in the election process. Those are predominantly Democratic ballots.
Movements to not count the vote were widely seen around America this 2020 presidential election, based on fraudulent claims by high-ranking officials. It is crucial that all of America's votes are counted, including those who mail in their ballots. Many other countries have enacted preferable voting procedures that result in a larger voter turnout.
And so as local officials, we get listed on anybody's ballot that falls within the Saratoga city limits. But the ballots within our city, there's probably 15 different ballots within our city.
But the last and most important part now is just making voting hard. And as simple as it sounds, it's actually the most effective way of suppressing the vote.
Through all this struggle and oppression, it is important to acknowledge how important one's vote is, and it is a right that everyone in this country should be given and should use to its fullest extent. What can you do to help lessen voter suppression in the US? Make sure your voice is heard. Talk to your friends and family about registering to vote and petition your representative to build more voting areas and make voting easy and accessible for all Americans.